I'm Courtney Fingar, Editor-in-Chief of FDI Magazine. I'm joined with my colleague Adrienne Klasa, editor of This is Africa, a sister publication. We've jointly produced for the second year in a row the Africa FDI Report, giving a taste of all the trends that we've seen throughout the past year in relation to FDI in the continent of Africa. Adrienne, what do you think is the most interesting top-line finding of the report?
Sure. Well, this has been an interesting year or 2-year period for the global economy, but especially for Africa. We're looking at a slightly more sober period. So obviously in the first decade after the millennium, we had sort of runaway growth in a lot of countries across the continent. Growth rates are still substantial in many countries across the continent, especially compared with what we're seeing in the developed world, but they are significantly slower. To a certain extent dragged down by sort of really major economies like South Africa and Nigeria, really struggling both for different regions. Nigeria is now dipped into recession. South Africa is sort of squeaking in at about 0.5%. And these are reflected actually in the figures and the data that we have in this year's Africa Investment Report. So we found that total FDI, and this is Greenfield's FDI into the region, totaled 66.5 billion. And that's a 24% decrease year on year. So clearly, investors are feeling a bit of the squeeze. Extractives are down, oil is down. So these are being reflected in the numbers.
This is a bit of a reversal of the more positive trend that we reported last year.
To a certain extent, it is. I mean, I think that also what you're seeing is because extractives investments tend to be so substantial, you're still seeing a lot of companies going into the region. So there are 495 companies that invested in greenfields projects across Africa through 2015. And so that's a 6% increase, actually. So we're seeing more companies going in, but the size of investments has decreased to a certain extent. And again, I think that partially reflects the fact that oil and gas investments, as well as mining, have decreased or have been shelved.
The overall headline of the report is that African FDI broadens its base. Talk to us a bit about what that means.
Well, I mean, I think that's actually very much in line with sort of the development strategies that are being espoused by countries and regional blocs within Africa itself. So the idea is to move away from extractives, to move away from exporting minerals and exporting gas, and to move economies up the value chain to industrialize. And so again, we are seeing less overall investment, but we're actually seeing one of the more interesting findings, I thought, was the fact that 44% of all FDI investment into the region for 2015 was into infrastructure-related industries, a lot of it into power, particularly, and that very much reflects the investment needs that are being voiced by governments and by authorities across the region. So I think that that's actually a very positive trend.
And what's your general outlook going forward? Do you think we'll see these trends coalesce and continue in the years to come?
I think that we're looking at a tough few years ahead. Again, the major economies, South Africa and Nigeria, are really struggling. That's probably going to continue for a while. I mean, Egypt was the top destination for 2015 in terms of FDI flows. Egypt is facing some pretty tough economic and political challenges, though. Despite sort of attracting a lot of investment into really big projects such as the Suez Canal expansion. So I think that this is going to be a much more sober period. Obviously, there is some economic pain associated with that. I don't think it is entirely a bad thing. You had sort of a big chase for yield, particularly after the global financial crisis coming into emerging markets. There was a lot of overheated rhetoric about sort of Africa rising. And I think that the region's overall long-term trends in terms of demographic growth, in terms of a growing middle class, are actually very positive and will increase demand for investments over the long term. But I think that a lot of the so-called hot money that sort of flowed in and was looking to make a quick buck is now retreating. And so perhaps we're seeing a more measured approach to investment in the region.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. And you can read all about these trends and more in the Africa FDI report available for download. Thank you.